Andrew Krystal with you. This is Krystal Nation, only on SiriusXM Channel 167. The Ministry of Truth is the book about a book. It's the biography of George Orwell's 1984. Author Dorian Lynskey joins us from London, England. Author, sex criminologist. I just threw that in. Mr. Lynskey has written a book about one of the greatest books. Certainly, it's a big youth influencer. In many ways, and you write 1984 isn't just a novel, it's a key to understanding our modern world. And the true test of great literature is its longevity and its relevance. And Eric Blair, otherwise known as George Orwell's book 1984, still has commanding prescience and commanding relevance in today's world. Perhaps some argue more than ever. Dorian Lynskey, thank you for joining us from London, England.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so what was it that prompted you to write about the book, to write about Orwell? Orwell has always been a good, historically as a journalist, a great truth teller. Christopher Hitchens wrote a book some years ago called Why Orwell Matters. What brought you back to Eric Blair?
Well, it was actually I was just becoming interested in the history of dystopian literature, and realizing that I'd read quite a few dystopian novels, and I didn't really understand the history. And so I started kind of thinking, could I tell that story and some other stories through the writing of 1984? But this idea came about in 2016, and then when I was working on the idea, Trump was elected. Then Trump was inaugurated. Then Kellyanne Conway referred to alternative facts. Then people started buying 1984 in huge numbers, and it felt sort of topical in a way that I didn't expect.
Yes. Why do you think I'm more fascinated by how he divided the world into three superstates that were self-contained, self-trading military megalopolises, Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia. And we see this tripartite division of the world to this day with the China-Russia sphere, Europe, and North America. So from an international relations perspective, never mind mind control, etc., and collectivized thought, I'm just as interested in that. But you think what sparked the dystopian fear was authority openly telling lies?
Yeah, it was the brazenness of the lying, and in 1984 and in the totalitarian regimes that inspired it, people tell lies in a way, not in a traditional way that most people would tell lies, which is they expect to be believed. It's the audacity of the lie. It's you demonstrate your power by saying something is blatantly untrue, and then just see how many people who work for you or support you are willing to go along with the lie. And I would not say at all that, Trump was a totalitarian or a big brother figure, but in his relationship to the truth is very similar to what Orwell was describing, and that seemed to be the thing that sort of triggered this impulse in people. That I just found fascinating, that the Kellyanne Conway's comment sparked this sudden interest in 1984, as if people knew sort of at the back of their minds that when something like this happened, this was the book that they should turn to. And so that was sort of proof of, I suppose, one of the kind of arguments behind my the original idea for the book was that it's always relevant, but in different ways. So it's not relevant in the same way it was in the Cold War. It's relevant in a very different way because there's just so many different ideas in the book.
Now, the title 1984 was pretty much arbitrary. It was written in 1948, correct?
It was, but that has nothing to do with 1984. It's not like he didn't reverse the digits. Because in the earlier drafts, it was set in 1980, then it was set in 1982, and basically the longer it took him to write the book, the further into the future he had to push it, because he really wanted it to be 35 years ahead of when the book was published.
Why that 35-year mark?
I mean, I think he never sort of explained this, he never sort of wrote this down why. I think it's one reason was because he wanted it to be, unlike most books about the future, which were either just around the corner, literally like next year, like Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, or centuries in the future. And 35 years was close enough to be kind of scary, but far enough away to sort of believe it. You don't think the world is going to, society's going to collapse next year, but you think 35 years, that could happen. And also, it makes Winston Smith, the hero of 1984, the same age as Orwell's adopted son, Richard Blair. And so I think that he was imagining the kind of world in which his son might reach middle age.
1984 is also a love story between the protagonist Winston Smith and Julia.
It is. It's an unusual love story because they don't really have a great deal in common. They have almost entirely different worldviews and different ways of negotiating the system in which they live. They're both rebels, but for completely different reasons. He's really interested in sort of interrogating the system he lives in, and she's just interested in sort of breaking the rules and without getting caught and finding a way around it. So it's a love story which sort of dramatizes this sort of intellectual idea of like, well, how do people live in a totalitarian regime? And there were some Winstons in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, and there were also a lot of Julias who knew that the system was, nonsense, didn't believe in it, but just sort of lived within it.
The book 1984 it deals with people being trapped in a system, and the system he was looking at was Soviet Russia. There was people today don't understand how terrified the world was of Soviet communism. There was a Red Scare in 1918. There were many Red Scares in the 1920s. For a while, Munich was taken over by a Russian-style Soviet during their civil war right after World War I, which could have tipped any which way. We in the 40s, right after World War II, people were petrified of the Soviet Union. And in our retrospective look at things, Dorian Lynskey, the public has forgotten that fear of Russia, very visceral fear.
Well, yeah, there was an enormous fear of Russian totalitarianism, but of course Orwell was also drawing on Nazi totalitarianism. The crucial difference being that had been defeated. So even though there are aspects of both systems in 1984, he really turned his fire on Stalin's Russia because that was not only still going strong, but it had the kind of the prestige, the sort of moral prestige of helping to defeat Hitler. And there was Orwell had this very pressing sense that a lot of outrages that were going on in Russia were just not being taken seriously in the West. Initially, not even by the kind of, the mainstream West, because they wanted Stalin as an ally, but certainly not the left. And this was, even though he was on the left, this was a cause of enormous tension between him and Stalinists on the left, because he basically said, well, how can you build socialism on principles of justice and fairness and equality if you are prepared to allow for all these crimes? So he wanted socialism. He wanted socialism in Britain. But he said you can't have this sort of contaminated dictatorial version of it.
Let's talk about people influenced by 1984. You reference everybody from Patrick McGoohan, who did The Prisoner dystopia many years ago. It was shot in Wales. It came out in the 60s. The Prisoner, which was very interesting and very avant-garde for its time. As a matter of fact, its final episode was unintelligible. It was that abstract. People were throwing things at their television. But everybody from Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassin, to Patrick McGoohan, let's talk about the people that you reference in your book, The Ministry of Truth, the people impacted by 1984, the novel.
It's a vast range. You had people behind the Iron Curtain who found it incredibly, so life-changingly moving, because it was the first time that they had read a novel, even though they had to read illegal copies because it was banned there. But it's the first time they'd read a novel that expressed the way that they felt about how they lived. It's very important to them. And then in America, for example, you had McCarthyites, sort of red baiters who liked it because obviously they thought it was a pure sort of anti-Soviet novel. But then you also had people on the left who embraced it because they saw it as bigger than that it wasn't just about Russia, that it was about all kinds of things, abusive language by politicians, surveillance, just organized deceit. And so people took from it lots of different things. And of course, as the climate changed and you moved out of the first phase of the Cold War, it allowed a lot more kind of radical sort of readings of it. So in the sort of Stevie Wonder song, Big Brother is Richard Nixon. So no longer a Stalin figure, but Richard Nixon. And then you have all the kind of creatives like Patrick McGowan or Margaret Atwood with The Handmaid's Tale, or Terry Gilliam with his movie Brazil. And they would all sort of take elements of 1984. They weren't plagiarizing it, but they were taking certain ideas. And what's interesting, I think, is that they all took different ideas. And because there's so much in the book, there's so much that's sort of well-known and very useful to other writers, that they're not all going for the same thing. They don't all have like a big brother and a thought police. They kind of zoom in on the aspects of the book which they think applies to their era, whether it be the 60s or the 80s or 2019.
The book is The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984. Dorian Lynskey joins me from London. The interesting thing about 1984 is it's the book that keeps on giving. Every generation seems to find a voice in it.
Yep, there's different themes rise to the surface. I think if you look at the reception in the 1950s, was that it was very much obviously shaped by the Cold War, and people were interested in totalitarianism as a as a living thing. That it was right there. And then, as the Soviet Union began to sort of wane in power in the 80s, it became more about technology. And people worried about, computer databases and closed-circuit TV cameras. And we still have that technology dimension now. I think people can look at facial recognition or deep fakes and think, if Big Brother's regime had this technology, they would have how they would have used it. But now there's this more sort of almost sort of philosophical theme of what is truth. And what is the relationship between truth and power? And I think most books, their theme is sort of set in stone. If there's a book about slavery, it remains about slavery at whatever point in time you're reading it. Whereas with 1984, there were so many ideas, because Orwell spent so many years thinking about it, like well over a kind of decade of reading and writing and talking and thinking about these ideas, that actually there's enough there that different kinds of readers, different eras can seize on different things. I think that's what makes it uniquely long-lasting, because almost if one aspect is exhausted, then people just zero in on another aspect.
It's also a good story. 1984 is a good story. There's nothing boring about the book 1984.
No, which you can't say about many of the utopias and anti-utopias that came out before 1984. Orwell had read a lot of them, and he was very struck.
We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back with more of Dorian Lynskey. I can't let this man go. The book is The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984, and its continuing relevance and meaning today. Back with more here on Crystal Nation. Don't go anywhere, because if you do leave, I will see that you've done it. I'm watching you. Andrew Krystal with you. This is Crystal Nation. Only on channel 167, SiriusXM. The book is The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984. Author Dorian Lynskey. Oh, yes. Even Bowie was influenced by 1984. The art world is all a titter with fake news, alternate facts, as what's her name said, the bleached blonde that wouldn't get hired anywhere else, the spokesperson for Trump. What's her name?
Kellyanne Conway.
I hate her guts. And so do you, obviously.
Yeah.
Britain must be going nuts with the Trump news. Every week, my wife will say, let's see if Don Lemon on CNN, how outraged he is. Let's see who's outraged. Every week it's a new Trump outrage. So, and I reference that, folks, because Dorian Lynskey wrote this book about Orwell's 1984 because of the White House, not just blowing through so many press people, but also making stuff up, alternative facts. But of course, there's no such thing. So this gets people to thinking, where are we going as a society? But there's two things that I want folks to remember as you listen to me speak with Dorian. I'm very fortunate to have you on air. One is the USA and Trump's unbelievable bullshit, and China, which is actively involved in repressing and monitoring its population with both facial recognition software and multiplicity of monitoring sources, all kinds of ways to monitor people, including their cashless society, which is another way of electronically monitoring individuals' purchases. So we deal with active BS on one side with the White House, and we see an authoritarian state, a totalitarian state, an Orwellian state involved in active suppression of its people. Newspeak was the dictionary that George Orwell made up in 1984. Its principle is you reduce the dictionary by so many words per week or per month or per year, and you reduce the means of people's capacity to express themselves. You not only control thinking, you control the means of thinking, you control the means of expression. You control meaning itself by introducing lies as fact. The Ministry of Truth was, in the novel, was actually the Ministry of Propaganda. Grotesque irony. So here we are. So we've got China on one side, Dorian Lynskey, an Orwellian nightmare. And it is. It's an Orwellian nightmare, China. And we have the White House with its balderdash. What are your thoughts? What would Orwell say? What would Orwell say about this?
I don't know whether he'd be surprised that people would use, the states would use technology in oppressive ways. I think China is much closer to Orwellian. China is much closer to it's a modern version of a totalitarian state with obviously aspects of capitalism and of and of sort of certain kind of freedoms, but ultimately sort of very oppressive. And I think perhaps what he would be intrigued by, I hate to claim to know what he would have thought, but perhaps what he'd be intrigued by is the way in which, as some people predicted, that sort of future autocracies would merge the tactics of the 1984 world, which is just sort of like brutal oppression, and the tactics of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was more seductive and lulling people with sort of pleasurable treats. And what used to happen was that people, like when 1984 came out, there was a big argument about you had to choose one. And Huxley himself was saying, he told Orwell, I really like your novel, but I think mine is more likely to come to pass. And actually what we see now in China and in Russia is a combination. Obviously not as extreme, because these were satires, which means they are the worst possible version of this idea. But it's a merger. It's the hybrid autocracy.
So the opiate of the masses wasn't religion, and with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, it was soma, I believe. Is that the drug? Some kind of feel-good drug.
Yep, yeah. Soma was the drug there. Yeah.
So the antecedents, the literary ones for 1984, would be Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was written in the 30s, and Evgeny Zamyatin, an obscure Russian science fiction author who wrote We. I forget which year, but 20s, 2021,
although it didn't come out until later for various reasons, i.e. Russians didn't want to publish it.
So Orwell stood on their shoulders.
Well, he was a great, it's a great work of synthesis, 1984. So basically the ideas, the vision sort of came from him and his own obsessions. But then he was always on the lookout for sort of other ideas, sometimes to sort of agree with and sometimes to argue with, and he would merge them. So those are two novels. He didn't take much from Brave New World because it is almost the opposite vision. He took a fair bit from Zamyatin. He also took stuff from H.G. Wells, who he had quite a kind of ambivalent relationship with. And then there are other kind of much less known dystopias like Swastika Night, which he may have taken a couple of ideas from. But many of his ideas cropped up in letters he wrote to friends, in articles he wrote, in books he reviewed. So he really was voracious, intellectually voracious, and anything that struck him as having something interesting to say about totalitarianism and about about power and about how people live under power, he would take aspects of it. And what I found interesting in the book was following, Zamyatin's novel actually had far more of an influence on Ayn Rand's first novel, and on George Lucas's first movie, and on the Lego movie. It's like that vision, far more so than I think on 1984. So even though the book is about Orwell and 1984, I do hope people will kind of find interesting the stories of these other writers, because everyone who wrote a dystopia or utopia at that time was basically trying to make a point about how they saw the world. They weren't just fun, tense stories. They were like, manifestos or philosophical essays with plots.
Dorian, I wasn't going to get into this, but I think I'm really glad to have you on air with me, because I want folks to know that what shocks me is the fact that old conversations that happened in cafes in the 1920s and the 1930s are now happening again. And it's what terrified, I think, a lot of people, especially George Orwell, whose real name was Eric Blair, with regards to Russia and the Soviet Union. And in the 60s, Marcuse talked about Soviet communism as being a way, and hippies embraced Mao, etc. And this is the war of ideas. What ideas are better? And and I know in the 1920s and 1930s, people would sit around and they'd have coffee or wine, and they would talk about how good Western liberalism is. In other words, democracy is kind of stupid and it's chaotic and it's a waste of time. And fascism, as Hitler said, how can you have 16 horses pulling a cart? You need a strong whip to have them go in one direction, which is exactly what the Chinese leadership says today. You can't rule more than 1 billion people without having a strong central government, or you would have chaos. My retort to that is India, which is a wonderful democracy for all its flaws. But we're having discussions about the efficiency and the efficaciousness and the common sense of democracies today. Is it useful? We have Russia on one side, China on the other, subversion of democratic processes with electoral machines and social media. In Russia, and even China's saying, you can't run an economy without being able to order it around as we do, with state investment in resources and playing the long game, as opposed to our mode of capitalism, which is return to shareholders as quickly as possible. So we're having this war of ideas as to the value of democracy, which I never thought I would live to see this. But this discussion about democracy is happening today, where people trying to say, no, democracy is bad. That's a bad Western idea. We know how to do this, and it's authoritarianism. Russia saying the same thing. Putin, democracy is a fool's game. And many in Europe, with Steve Bannon, who just wants to go around and get Trump's former advisor. He just wants to go to buffets and have an audience and get some money. Seriously. Have you seen Steve Bannon's reading list? It has this fascist author Evola and a whole bunch of freaks on it. I mean, the self-taught people are always very, very chaotic with their reading. He's an autodidact and an a-hole, Steve Bannon. But essentially a fascist, trying to warm over fascism. And people are trying to warm over, Dorian, fascist ideas and trying to sell them to us as that which is more efficient, which is what the Nazis did. It is. Your thoughts?
Well, I suppose one reason I found writing the book kind of therapeutic was because I could, I'd get very frustrated and outraged at various things, and I'm on the left. I tend to find most of my time being angry with the right, but there's also aspects of the left where I feel that kind of like the sort of the ghost of Stalinism, and I just feel like this was something that the left should have shed by now. And what I found very encouraging and helpful was just be able to sit down with a pile of books or at my laptop and realize that Orwell and some of his contemporaries were wrestling with this stuff at the time under worse circumstances. Bad though things are now, we're not actually we don't have Hitler, Stalin, and a world war. And a cynic would add yet. But we don't have that, and so seeing how people thrashed out the kind of the moral complexities of it and the political complexities. That Orwell was trying to negotiate this space where he hated fascism, he hated Stalinism, he really didn't like mainstream conservatism. He believed in a certain kind of democratic socialism, but a very kind of open one with full sort of freedom of speech and none of the kind of autocratic tendencies. And it's enormously comforting, I think, to read anything by Orwell, not just 1984, and see somebody struggling to kind of work out how does one behave decently in a terrible time? How does one find a path through what seem to be these two kind of rival systems that are equally bad? And I don't think we're in a situation like 30s, but there's too many echoes of the 30s. There's also echoes of the kind of weird period in the 70s, where after Pinochet in Chile, when there was a lot of talk about whether democracy was worn out, the center had collapsed, and the future was either going to be very far right or very far left. And
that seems to be where we are today, though.
I mean, that's what people are saying. But history can be sort of useful because sometimes it can show you, okay, here's the worst. The worst did happen, and this is how people responded.
Dorian, I got to have a few more minutes with you. I'm going to take a quick break and come back with I Can't Leave You, Can't Leave Me Now. I've got more to ask you. This great book. Okay. Go and get it. The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984. This is more relevant today than it's ever been. My feelings anyway. Back with more of Dorian Lynskey from London right after this. Andrew Krystal with you. This is Krystal Nation. Dorian Lynskey joins me from London, England. He's the author of The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984. Before the break, we were talking about the arguments that occurred right after World War I, when Soviet communism was released upon the world. Many were afraid that the world would either be fascist or communist. And the world no longer had time for democracy. And it seems like we're moving back to that space. And I think what empowers notions of fascism and societal control over the individual is this new technology. For example, Dorian, we got our cell phones on now. Mine's on silent, right? Well, if someone wanted to target us, let's say for some reason you had some secrets, or you had a relationship with a Russian agent or whatever, they can target us exactly where we're standing. They know they can access where we went to the bank the last time we bought gas, or in your case in England, petrol. Whatever. We're more knowable than ever, including technology which allows our televisions to not only let us view things as we purchase them to view things, but they can spy on us, where people can actually turn the television to a telescreen like 1984 and view us, where remote control AI devices can listen in on your every conversation. We are more of 1984, the novel, than ever.
But it's quite bizarre that it's something that we signed up to, because I think in the 80s, Walter Cronkite did a program about kind of what 1984 means in the year 1984, and one of his concerns was computer databases. If you linked up the government databases with the bank databases, we're talking about 1980s computers here.
Right.
So quite limited in the data that they had. But he was concerned about that. But it was always, people's fears were always like, well, what will the government do? And obviously the government does do things with data. The Edward Snowden leaks kind of revealed that. But I think what is surprising, and really gets to kind of the reason why Orwell wrote 1984, is that people have signed up to so much of this kind of invasive technology, and I try not to be sort of too paranoid about it. So there's certain things where I kind of I draw the line, and I think this is weird, having these kind of devices sort of harvesting your information, and it's that kind of going along with things because you think it'll be fine, and then you just need the wrong people to have access to that data, and then you're in enormous trouble. And one of the messages embedded in the book, but also when Orwell talked about the book, was, it's up to you. Be careful. It's not If you want freedom of speech, you have to preserve it. You have to demand it. If you want, liberty to do this or that, that's something that you have to protect. It was meant to be a very galvanizing book, and I suppose writing Ministry of Truth has given me a kind of really different perspective on some of the decisions that you make around technology and what data you give away, and made me draw more lines.
There was a news story, Dorian, about some face application where you're able to see yourself age, and that's going to the Russians, who are able to monitor your face. This goes back, it's a trap in order to have you part of their facial recognition umbrella.
Yeah, I don't know the exact details of that story. I do know that facial recognition technology is developed by, for example, people tagging themselves on Facebook, tagging themselves and their friends, and that actually helped develop facial. So we're all kind of like volunteering to kind of help them develop this technology, sort of in the hope that that nobody will misuse it. And I think the great shock that we've had since 2016 and the stories that came out about Russian interference in that election and in elections around the world is how vulnerable we are to disinformation and manipulation, and the technology is only going to advance in order to, allowing people to create sort of deep fakes and creating very, very convincing
This reduces freedom.
Doesn't happen.
In order to have freedom, you have to have a degree of privacy. You have to have a degree of privacy, which we're losing.
I mean, that was Orwell's firm belief. He was very private. He was a very private man, and he thought that was fundamental. But actually, virtually every dystopia involved, early dystopia, even going back to like the 19th century, involves a loss of privacy. Like, that was always felt to be true. And the idea that we can surrender privacy without losing any freedom, because so far things, in our own lives seems to be okay, but we've already seen the effects on the political system. And I just think that people should think a little more carefully about what they are complicit in, because
do you have kids?
Oppression needs complicity.
Do you have kids, Dorian?
I do too, yeah.
Are you concerned about what the future holds for them in terms of freedom, in terms of Orwell's 1984 dystopia?
I'm more concerned about climate change, so I just pile that onto my mountain of concern. I just think, honestly, the one thing I came away with from just reading everything that Orwell wrote, 2 million words I think it is that he wrote in total, was just endeavor to be honest. That's the basic thing. I'm on Twitter every day, and you just see so many people failing even to be honest. It's pure sort of partisan dishonesty, and I feel you have to start with yourself. Much though I would like to change the world in a bigger way, I think you can at least start with yourself and examine your own motives and your biases and think, am I being honest here, or am I just saying this to score a political point? And I think if everybody did that, we would be in a better position, because it's not the technology, it's how people use the technology, and that's the danger.
Who were Orwell's gods? He was friends with H.G. Wells. Who else?
Well, kind of friends. Tense. He knew H.G. Wells. Who did he admire?
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of admiration for Andrew Krystal, who was the founder of the National Health Service, and he was kind of the Labour politician that he really admired. And he had some he had some great friends, in the sort of writing community and across the political spectrum, really, conservatives, anarchists, socialists. In terms of writers, he was a huge fan of Jonathan Swift and Charles Dickens. He was such an independent-minded person that I found that even when he really loved someone, he just had to argue with them.
And his essays on rhetoric, political rhetoric, still are very powerful today. He didn't like people using Latin expressions. He thought that was pretentious. I mean, Orwell was a fascinating thinker.
He was, about many, many different things, from hugely important ideas to quite trivial things, like just sort of nature writing or writing about pubs. It was also very kind of insightful and evocative. He was interested in a lot of things.
Thank you so much for taking time with us. The book is The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984, a book that still gives us much intellectual food today. Thank you, Dorian. God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Dorian Lynskey joined us from London. I'll see you folks next week. Check me out on Twitter, @Andrew Krystal with a K.